30 East Drive is the address of a rundown ex-council house which is said to be the most haunted house in all of the UK, and it sits inside a housing estate on the outskirts of Pontefract. Pontefract is a historic market town in the metropolitan borough of Wakefield in West Yorkshire, and according to historians, the town itself has a very dark history. The haunting of 30 East Drive first started way back in 1966. Either that, or it is the first time it was ever acknowledged. The house still stands today. In fact, if you're brave enough, you can actually pay to spend the night in the ex-council house in Pontefract. The man who now owns the house is a Mr. Bill Bungay, who just happens to be a film producer. And Bill actually made a movie about the haunting called When the Lights Went Out. I actually purchased the film in preparation for this episode, and I can tell you it's actually a very good movie. It's very creepy and scary. There are elements from this actual story in the film, but it's not necessarily 100% accurate to this story. Of course, for the sake of entertainment, it has been heavily dramatised, but it is still a very good, creepy, scary film, and I urge anyone to seek it out and watch it. So like I said, Bill is a movie producer, and at the time when he was working on this horror film, he was looking for a clever way to promote it. When all of a sudden, Bill had a great idea, a perfect way to promote this movie. He would simply buy the actual house, 30 East Drive. After all, it was empty and for sale, and more importantly, it was very cheap. It was dirt cheap. And so that's exactly what Bill did, and he decided to have a red carpet event at the actual house and show the movie to the media and 2 lucky competition winners. And well, it didn't go too well. The film didn't really take off straight away, although now it is considered a little bit of a cult classic. It didn't really take off straight away, and after the event was all over, Bill was left with a supposed haunted house on his hands. And you may be interested to know that Bill didn't believe the house was actually haunted. He just wanted to make a good horror movie based on a so-called real haunting. You see, Bill was a real skeptic. He didn't necessarily believe in ghosts or haunted houses or the paranormal in general. All that was about to change, because it wouldn't be long before the poltergeist that had been fairly dormant was about to wake up. But before we cover the activity in the house these days, let's first go back to 1966 when the Prichard family moved into 30 East Drive and the horror began. The Black Monk of Pontefract story starts way back in August of 1966 at 30 East Drive. The Prichard family consisted of Jean and Joe Prichard, their son Philip, who was 15 years old at the time, and daughter Diane, who was 12 years. The house is a very modest council house, nothing fancy or spectacular about it. Nothing like your usual haunted manor or grand house you would see in movies. This is simply a 2-bed basic house that are not uncommon in the UK. In fact, that's possibly why the case is so terrifying to many, because it's relatable. It's a normal looking house, the same kind many people live in, so it's easy to imagine this happening to yourself in your own home. Like I said, it was August 1966 and the family had gone away to Devon for a holiday during the bank holidays. But Philip had decided he didn't want to go on holiday and he decided to stay behind, so Jean Prichard's mother came over to stay and look after Philip and the house. It was a sunny Thursday afternoon and Philip decided to take a book into the garden and read, leaving his grandmother alone in the lounge knitting. As Philip sat outside in the warm sun, his grandmother felt a strange chill in the room, and then as 11:30 AM approached, a strange gust of wind blew through the house, rattling windows and slamming doors. Philip came back into the house to investigate. Philip's grandmother asked if there was a wind getting up outside. Philip said no, it's actually quite calm. So Philip's grandmother shrugged it off and went back to her knitting, whilst Philip went into the kitchen to make them both a drink. 10 minutes later, he returned into the lounge, and he was shocked at what he saw. His grandmother was so busy with knitting that she was totally oblivious to a grey-white powder that she was totally submerged in, like chalk dust or talc powder. Philip brought the powder-like substance to his grandmother's attention, and they both peered up to the ceiling. The first thing they did was obviously trying to make sense of the whole thing. Their initial thought was that the powder was coming from the ceiling because the Pritchards had just recently redecorated. It could have been a sound explanation, but in close examination it would seem the dust actually lay separate from the ceiling. The area near the ceiling was actually clear of this chalky, powdery substance. In fact, Philip recalled that when his grandmother stood, her head reached above the chalk dust that just lingered there in the air. Now at this point they weren't afraid, more like confused as to where it was coming from, so Philip's grandmother called her daughter Marie Kelly, who lived across the road, to come and have a look. When Marie arrived at the house, she was shocked to see this dust-like substance floating in the air. The dust had also settled all over the furniture, and it was also floating in the drinks that Philip had made, and Philip's grandmother had become covered head to toe in this white powdery substance. Now Marie went into the kitchen to grab a cloth to start cleaning when she slipped on the lino floor, where a puddle of water had formed. But here's the strange thing about this puddle. Once this puddle was mopped up, it simply reappeared. And then, when it was mopped up once again, it simply reappeared once again, like there was a leak underneath the floor and this water was just coming up. And in fact, that's what they actually thought was happening. They thought that the water was simply coming up through the floor. So they pulled back the lino to find that the floor was bone dry, and yet the water still returned in neat, perfect little circles. Next door to 30 East Drive lived Enid Prichard, who was married to Joe Prichard's brother. Enid arrived at the scene after hearing all the commotion and went to find the stopcock underneath the sink. She turned the tap to off and hoped that the flow of water would now stop, but still the puddles kept appearing, and so a plumber was finally called, who, surprise surprise, couldn't find anything wrong. He couldn't find any leaks whatsoever. And eventually, after about an hour, the water stopped appearing and everyone returned to their homes quite confident that the strange occurrences had stopped happening, when in fact it had only just begun. Later that day at around 7 PM, the activity all started up again. As Philip's grandma went into the kitchen to make a cup of tea, she noticed that the worktops in the kitchen were covered in tea leaves and sugar, and the button on the tea maker was apparently flicking on and off, on and off, on and off, which made an awful mess all over the draining board. Probably out of pure confusion and desperation to explain what was going on, Philip's grandmother pointed the finger at him, to which Philip responded that it wasn't him. All of a sudden there was an almighty crash that came from the hallway. They both went to investigate, and as they opened the door that led into the dark hallway, the light clicked on all by itself. And then they noticed what made the crashing noise. It was a potted plant that normally sits at the bottom of the stairs, and now it was halfway up the stairs and it had actually left the pot itself. But the pot couldn't be found anywhere. Eventually it was located at the top of the stairs on the landing. Somehow it had managed to travel from the bottom of the stairs all the way to the top. As they stood staring at the pot, a loud vibrating sound came from the kitchen. It was a cupboard which held all the plates and cups. It was shaking violently on the wall. Philip grabbed the door to the cupboard and the shaking suddenly stopped, only to be replaced by another noise coming from elsewhere in the house. It was at this point I think they probably thought enough was enough, and they both fled the house, running across the road to the daughter Marie's house. When they arrived, they explained what had been going on at 30 East Drive, and still after some kind of rational explanation, they all ventured back over to the house to investigate. And when they got there, they found that the cupboard was once again shaking violently on the wall. Now, on the opposite side of the house lived a neighbour named Mrs. Mountain. The Pritchards and Mrs. Mountain shared a wall. So naturally, their first thought was that Mrs. Mountain was doing something on her side of the house, maybe some housework, which was affecting their side of the wall and somehow shaking the cupboard with the plates and cups in. And so they went knocking on Mrs. Mountain's door to ask if she was responsible for the strange occurrences that were happening in their house. And to their horror, Mrs. Mountain simply said that she actually thought it was the Pritchards making all the noise. When Marie, Philip and his grandmother returned to the house, the activity had stopped. After a while of nothing happening, Marie said she was going back home across the road to go to bed, and if anything else was to happen, they should go and get her immediately. Philip and his grandmother went to bed. They were exhausted, and they were ready for sleep. Now, I was wondering how they could possibly think about going to bed in that house at this stage, and the only explanation I can think of is that they were still trying to find a rational explanation for everything that was happening, and paranormal activity was simply being pushed to the back of the mind, maybe on purpose. As they got settled for the night, Philip's grandmother went into Philip's room to kiss him goodnight before she settled herself. As she went in to kiss him, she noticed that he was staring past her and over her shoulder. His eyes were wide and filled with fear. As she turned, she saw the wardrobe moving and shaking from one side to the other. In the book Poltergeist by Colin Wilson, he described it as a drunken man tottering and swaying from side to side. Philip and his grandmother didn't need any more persuading. They left the house right there and then and went across the road to her daughter's, and there they stayed the night. Once Philip and his grandmother had finally calmed down from the horrifying ordeal they had just gone through, they finally fell asleep in Marie's house. Marie and her husband Vic decided that they needed to investigate further. After all, sleep was not going to happen tonight. They were too curious as to what was happening in the house across the road. Now, one thing I must tell you is that Marie's husband was a rational man. He didn't believe in the paranormal or the supernatural. He believed there was a simple explanation to be found. And that is why Vic picked up the phone and rang the police. It wasn't long before 3 police officers arrived, and accompanied by Marie and Vic, they all entered 30 East Drive. The police initially thought there may be an intruder, and so they searched the house completely, checking for forced entry, looking in wardrobes, cupboards, under the stairs, under the beds, and eventually came to the conclusion that everything was fine, and they returned to the police station. And Vic and Marie returned home. But they were still not ready to give up on this. After all, Marie had also seen some strange things happening in that house, and she wanted answers. And then Marie had a thought. A little way down the street there lived a man named Mr. MacDonald who had an interest in the paranormal and the unexplained. She thought maybe he could help. But the hour was late. It was getting on to midnight at this point, and they wondered whether he would actually be awake or not. So they had a walk down the street, and they discovered that his living room light was still on, so it would seem that he was still up, and so they knocked at his house. Mr. O'Donnell opened the door, looking a little bit confused as to why these people were knocking at this time of night. But when they were given a chance to explain themselves, he didn't hesitate. He grabbed his coat, locked up his house, and headed towards 30 East Drive. When they arrived at the house, it was all eerily quiet. And so they simply sat there in the house waiting for some kind of activity. As he sat there in the lounge, Mr. O'Donnell explained the differences between a ghost and a poltergeist. He explained that a poltergeist could be a manifestation of the mind. He believed young Philip was responsible for it, but Philip was across the street now and fast asleep. So they believed nothing much was going to happen that night, and at around 1:30 p.m, they all decided to call it a night. Nothing was happening. As they were getting ready to leave the house, Mr. O'Donnell left with one more bit of information on poltergeists. He told them that poltergeists do strange things like rip up photographs, but without Philip's presence, they agreed that nothing was going to happen tonight. The reasoning behind this, I believe, is that many people believe that poltergeists actually feed off the energy from children who have just gone into puberty, and normally it revolves around girls. You hear a lot of stories about poltergeists, like feeding off the energy of young girls. But in this case, Mr. O'Donnell believed that it was actually Philip who was attracting the poltergeist, but as he was not in the house at the moment, they decided to leave. And with that, Mr. O'Donnell said goodnight and headed on home. As Marie and Vic switched off the lights, they were about to lock the door when they heard a massive crash coming from the darkness. They returned back into the house and switched on the lights to the lounge, and on the floor lay 2 small oil paintings that were face down, and glass from the frames lay scattered all around. And then they noticed a picture of Jean and Joe on their wedding day, which had been sliced all the way across it. It would seem that the ghost or the poltergeist had heard exactly what Mr. O'Donnell had said, and it would also seem that it was very much aware of everything. The next day, Philip and his grandmother returned to the house and all was quiet. Eventually, Jean and Joe Prichard and the young daughter Diane returned home from their holiday, and Philip and his grandmother couldn't wait to tell them everything that had happened while they'd been on their trip. Understandably, Jean and Joe Prichard didn't exactly believe any of it. They thought it was laughable. But Philip's grandmother, Jean's mother, was desperate for them to understand what had happened and desperate for them to know that it did happen and they weren't going crazy. So she went on to describe in detail what had happened that day when the cold wind blew through the house and the windows and the doors rattled and shook. And then she told Jean of the strange knocking that could be heard from the house. Jean asked what kind of knocks, and as she uttered these words, 3 very loud bangs rang out from somewhere in the house. A cold wind blew through the house, rattling the windows and slamming the doors. And just like that, it was gone. The temperature returned to normal. It would seem that the entity had left, and for the following 2 years, all was well. But eventually, the entity did return, and when it did, it returned with a vengeance. 2 years later, Philip had now left school and went to work in his father's pet shop. Diane was now a teenager, and Mrs. Scholes, the grandmother, was now 72 and spent the weekends with the Prichards. Mrs. Scholes had never forgotten the strange things that happened 2 years previously, and had recently started to bring it up in conversation. The family didn't appreciate Grandma bringing up these paranormal activity stories. They wanted to forget, but it was obviously bothering Mrs. Scholes. One afternoon, Jean had decided to decorate Diane's bedroom. After a while, she decided it was time for a drink and went downstairs to make a cup of tea for herself and her mother, who was once again talking about the entity. When Jean had finished her drink, she decided to head back upstairs and continue with the decorating, and I can imagine she was getting a little bit fed up of all the talk of ghosts and poltergeists. As Jean approached the bottom of the stairway, she noticed that Diane's counterpane off her bed had somehow made its way downstairs and was lying on the hallway floor. Now, Jean thought this was strange how Diane's bedsheet had left her bed and made its way to the bottom of the stairs, but Jean just shrugged it off and took it back upstairs to Diane's bedroom and proceeded to carry on with the decorating. It wasn't long before she heard a very large crash. She ran out to the landing and peered down the stairs. There was another counterpane bedsheet at the bottom of the stairs. This time, it was Philip's, and it was surrounded by many plant pots that had fallen and spilled soil all over the floor. It would seem that Mrs. Scholes was right. It had returned. Many speculate if it returned because Mrs. Scholes was constantly talking about it. Who knows, maybe it did. Maybe Mrs. Scholes gave it the attention it needed to return. Or maybe Mrs. Scholes simply started talking about it because it had returned and she could feel it. But one thing I can tell you is that Mrs. Scholes did not stay there that night. She went home. That night, as the Prichards all slept, Jean lay wide awake. It was a very warm night and it was making her restless, so she decided to get up. She hadn't yet finished decorating Diane's bedroom, and all the paint supplies she had removed earlier on that night out onto the landing. As Jean stepped out of her bedroom into the darkness of the landing with only the outside street lamp shining through the window, she noticed a chill in the air. And then she noticed something in the corner of her eye, and as she peered down the dark landing, she could see an object floating in mid-air. It was accompanied by a rustling noise. As soon as Jean flicked on the landing light, a paintbrush went flying past her head, followed by a paste bucket, splashing paint all over the place. In shock, Jean stared towards the rustling noise, and it was a roll of wallpaper that had somehow been manipulated into the shape of a snake, as it swayed back and forth as if it was getting ready to strike. Jean made a grab at the paper, and whatever power was manipulating it dispersed, and it rolled out onto the floor. As soon as this happened, a carpet sweeper flew up into the air, spinning around in a crazy spiral. Jean dropped to her hands and knees and crawled back to her bedroom, a roll of wallpaper smashing against the door as she entered the room. Jean finally found her voice and screamed, waking Joe and the kids, who came running onto the landing to see what was going on. Paintbrushes once again started to fly through the air at an incredible speed and managed to strike Diane on the shoulder. But incredibly, she would later say, despite the speed it was travelling, it didn't hurt her at all. All the activity on the landing abruptly stopped and restarted in Diane's bedroom. Philip had a clear view into the room and witnessed a wooden pelmet that was screwed in above Diane's window break away, tearing the screws from the wall, and then flew out of the window and fell outside the house. I'm assuming the window was left open that night due to how warm it was. Joe ran to Diane's door and slammed it shut, and as he did so, total chaos broke loose inside the room. From the other side of the door, it sounded as if every object in Diane's room was being thrown around in complete anger. For some reason, maybe a moment of madness, Diane decided to reach out for her doorknob and try to open the door. Her father shouted, "Don't touch it," and as though the entity was responding to Joe, it sent a tremendous thump to the bedroom door that shook the door frame. That night, the entire Prichard family slept in Joe and Jean's room with the door locked, but to be honest, it probably wouldn't have helped. Now at this part of the story, I should probably say that up until this happening, Joe didn't actually believe in the poltergeists. Everyone else kind of bought Philip and Mrs. Scholes' story, but Joe was a bit of a skeptic and he thought they were all just being a little bit silly and he didn't really believe in the poltergeist. But if there was one thing that changed his mind, it was that night and another incident that happened to him. Apparently one day Joe had ventured into the coal shed. Now, Apparently when he was inside the shed, he got the sense that there was a horrible feeling, like a presence that joined him, and the door to the coal shed locked and he was unable to get out, and he could feel this presence in there with him in the dark. It's unknown what actually happened in the shed with Joe. He never really spoke of it. However, this and the events that happened on that night did change his mind about the poltergeists from that point on. And it was from that day on that activity in the house started to pick up a lot. Don't get me wrong, there were days when nothing happened at all, but then there were days when it would just go crazy. And here's a good example. One day Jean had a friend over and they were stood in the hallway chatting when they noticed something strange coming from the top of the landing. You see, at the top of the stairs stood an old grandfather clock, and they noticed that it had begun to sway ever so slightly back and forth, and then, without warning, the grandfather clock comes smashing down the stairs, breaking into pieces when it hit the bottom. It would seem that the poltergeist was doing everything it could in its power to be noticed. And the poltergeist also gave off the impression that it was very much aware of its surroundings, and it was aware of the Prichards. At times its attacks were random, and at other times it seemed like it was listening and responding to things the Prichards had actually said in conversation. Sometimes it seemed it was creating noise purely for attention, like a child. It craved it. Sometimes the knocks seemed to be made in desperation, and Colin Wilson's book did a good job at describing this. In the book, he said that it was like someone knocking on your front door, desperately wanted to come in. And then at other times it simply seemed mischievous, like a practical joker. And so you couldn't blame the Prichards for starting to feel like their unwanted guest did indeed have a personality all of its own. And although they were still very afraid of the entity, maybe this is one of the reasons they didn't up and leave. In fact, they even named the entity. They named it Mr. Nobody, and later they would rename it Fred. Now, as I mentioned earlier, poltergeist stories seem to revolve around teenagers who are going through puberty, like they feed off the teenagers' energy. If this is true, it would explain why Fred the poltergeist was noticeably quieter during the day when Diane, who was a teenager at the time, was at school. But when night fell, Fred would wake up and start to bang on the walls. He'd bang on the doors, he'd move furniture. He also had a reputation for turning off the house lights at the fuse box under the stairs. One particular night, as the lights went off once again for the umpteenth time, Jean decided to take some sticky tape and actually stick the switch down on the fuse box so that it couldn't be flicked once again. But within half an hour, the lights were off again. Jean went to the switch box to find that the tape, which was holding the switch in position, had simply vanished into thin air. After a while, the Prichards decided enough was enough, and a Reverend Davy was called to try and exorcise the entity known as Fred. After the church granted permission, Reverend Davy turned up at the house and waited for any sign of a haunting. The Reverend and the Pritchards sat in the living room for an hour and a half, and nothing happened. And so the Reverend was probably getting a little bit frustrated and probably felt that his time was being wasted, and he got up to leave. He decided that there was nothing going on in this house. There was no ghost, there was no poltergeist. The Pritchards were just simply time wasters. Maybe they were just after their 5 minutes of fame. As he got up to leave, the house just seemed to come alive, and there were bangs and loud bumps and thumps coming from all around the house, and then a candlestick fell from the mantelpiece to the floor. The vicar was still not convinced. He suggested this was simply subsidence in the house. Nothing more, nothing less. As if the entity was listening, another candlestick floated from the mantelpiece and made its way over to the vicar and just hung there in the air in front of his nose before dropping to the ground. It was at this point that Jean couldn't help but be a little amused, as she asked if he still believed it was simply subsidence. The vicar stood there trying to come to terms with what he had just seen, when all of a sudden there was an enormous crash that came from the other room. As they returned into the room to investigate, they discovered that every single plate and cup from Jean's china cupboard had been scattered all over the floor, and incredibly, not one was broken. The vicar composed himself, took a deep breath, and then offered the following advice. Move house. but for some reason Jean refused to be ran out of her own home. That night, as Diane was making her way upstairs, once again the lights went out and she stood in the hallway in complete darkness as Joel Prichard was looking for a torch. As Diane stood there in the hallway, she noticed a dark shadow form on the wall, and that familiar cold chill made the hairs on her arm stand up. In the hall was a big piece of oak furniture that floated into the air and pinned Diane between it and the stairs. As soon as the lights were on, Jean noticed what had happened and she called for Joe to help. They both grabbed the oak stand and tried in vain to lift it off Diane, who was now panicking underneath. But here's the thing, it wasn't hurting her, it was just pinning her down, like some unseen force was pushing it down on her. Jean suggested Diane calm down and try to relax. I don't know how, but she managed it, and the entity, or Fred, released her. Jean took Diane to bed, and that is something I'll never understand. How do you simply sleep after something like that has just happened? I mean, maybe the activity was happening that often that they become kind of numb to it, like it was the norm. But still, I don't think I would sleep soundly that night. And funnily enough, Diane didn't. You see, that night Diane got into bed and Fred continuously flipped her out of bed and threw a mattress on top of her on the floor. This happened a total of 4 times. Eventually the press came round to write stories on the house. 30 East Drive was becoming a bit of an attraction. Would-be ghost hunters were knocking at the door to ask if they could come in and investigate. The Pritchards would wake up in the morning to find that people had actually camped out all night in front of the house in hopes of hearing or seeing something. And miners on their way to work in the pits in the mornings would often report hearing Fred the Poltergeist banging and knocking for their attention. And Fred was about to demand a whole lot more attention of the Pritchards. The press and the public were loving it. But inside the house, when those lights went out, it was far from entertainment, and Fred, it would seem, was getting stronger, and it wouldn't be long before he began to manifest his true appearance. One day, as Jean was out and about doing a few errands, she bumped into a friend named Renee Holden, Vic Kelly's sister from across the road. Renee had a bit of a reputation for being a little bit psychic, so Jean invited her to the house to meet Fred, the poltergeist. On Renee's first visit to the house, she discovered that Fred had totally trashed all 3 bedrooms. Inside the room, the bedroom drawers had been pulled out and the contents were thrown everywhere. Jean explained that before she had left the house, she had just tidied the rooms. It was almost as though Fred knew that Jean was house proud, and he took pleasure in messing up the house as Jean went around cleaning up. Apart from the mess, Fred was quiet that day, but the next time Renee visited, he showed her exactly what he was capable of. It was a Saturday evening. Joel Prichard was out that day. Mrs. Scholes was in bed feeling unwell, and Philip and Diane were watching television. Jean and Renee had just made sandwiches and joined Philip and Diane in the lounge. They had hardly sat down when the lights went out. A cold chill blew through the room and chaos followed. In the darkness, unidentified objects were flying around the room, and there was a constant knocking on the windows. When Jean had finally managed to flick the lights back on, they could see that cushions and ornaments had been thrown all over the place. This was all normal for Fred, but this time, he did something new. Jean and Renee noticed that the sandwiches were missing. They had gone, totally vanished. But eventually they did find them behind the television set, and upon closer examination they found that a huge bite had been taken out of one of the sandwiches by something with massive teeth. Now Renee was so fascinated with this, I believe she actually kept the sandwich. Now I'm not sure if she intended to preserve it somehow, but within a few days it had actually crumbled to pieces. Renee would witness more and more activity in the house with the Pritchards. On one particular night when Renee was visiting the house, the lights went out once again, and just as before, objects were being thrown all around the room in the darkness. Renee actually commented that she felt as though her hair was crawling with ants. And then, just as the lights came back on, Fred decided to hit a full pelt in the face with her cushion. And like I said before, you got the impression sometimes that Fred was being a little bit mischievous, and I would say that this was definitely one of those times by throwing this cushion into Renee's face. Now, Renee suggested that Fred was soaking up energy wherever he could. Apparently, the children had reoccurring stomach aches. Renee wondered if Fred was drawing energy from the kids' solar plexus. Now, when I read this, I did a little bit of research on the solar plexus and energy coming from that area. I'm not an expert on this, but I think Renee must have believed in chakras and that the stomach held certain energies there. And this is where she believed the poltergeist was drawing the energy from to create all this activity. Now, it is also believed that there was an underwater stream running under the house, as well as a well, which some neighbours have confirmed does exist, and it actually is buried underneath the living room floor. Now, the next part of the story is actually quite amusing. Now, I've mentioned that poltergeists seem to have a personality at times. Well, on this occasion, it showed its humorous side. Now, Joel Prichard had a sister, and his sister was called Maud, and she had heard an awful lot about this so-called poltergeist that troubled her brother's family. She didn't believe a word of it. She actually accused the children of playing silly games, silly jokes. Annoyed by this, Joel and Jean invited her round to witness the activity for herself. Or actually, I kind of get the impression that she probably invited herself. And so, whilst Maud was visiting, they all sat in the kitchen. Now, once again, the usual set of events went into motion. The lights went out and a chill blew through the room. Maud sat there in the dark, with a red glow of the kitchen fire illuminating her face. As she sat there, she noticed that the fridge door slowly opened with ease, and a jug of milk floated from the fridge up into the air and then floated towards Maud. Once it was above her head, it tilted and drenched her in milk. And on this occasion, it was actually Diane who found the light switch, flicked the lights back on to find Maud spluttering and choking on all this milk that had just been tipped over her head. Maud was drenched. She immediately blamed the children. It would seem she was in denial. Maud needed more evidence of this poltergeist. To be honest, if I saw a jug of milk float through the air and tip over my head, I think that would be all the evidence I needed, but apparently Maud needed a little bit more evidence, so she agreed to stay the night. So as Maud settled in for the night, she removed her coat and she removed her hat, but she couldn't find her gloves that she had already removed earlier on that day. As they moved into the lounge, the lights went off once again, and the usual bangs and clattering could be heard in the darkness until the lights eventually came back on. And when they did, everyone noticed that the electric fire which was in the kitchen had been moved. The chairs were all turned upside down, and the contents of the fridge were just scattered everywhere all over the kitchen. Nothing happened for the rest of the evening, until, that is, the family went to bed. Jean, Diane and Maud all slept in the same room that night, probably a little bit shaken by what she'd seen, but still not 100% convinced. Obviously, she was in denial, this woman. As Jean settled into bed, the reading lamp rose into the air and simply floated out of the room. Now, as you can imagine, as this lamp was floating through the door, everyone's attention in the room would have been on this lamp, and that is when they all noticed the bulbs from the downstairs fireplace floating in the doorway as the lamp passed by. And then they noticed something horrifying that they had never seen before. A big dark hand appeared at the top of the door and another dark hand at the bottom. And then they noticed that the hands were actually Aunt Maud's fur gloves. The same gloves that went missing earlier that evening. It would seem that Fred was actually wearing the gloves. Terrified by this, Maud screamed, "Get away, you're evil," and threw a boot at the door, and then the gloves momentarily vanished into thin air and then reappeared. One of the gloves seemed to be motioning or beckoning for them to follow it, whilst the other clenched a fist and seemed to shake it in Maud's direction in a threatening manner. Now, at this point, Maud was absolutely petrified, and she actually turned to religion, and she started singing a religious song, "Onwards, Christian Soldiers," and hilariously, as she started doing this, the gloves actually started to conduct her like a conductor would in front of an orchestra. and I believe the intention was to mock her more than anything else. And I think this is my favourite part of the story, that the gloves were actually conducting her. Whether you believe this is true or false, that is very inventive storytelling nonetheless, whether it's real or not. So after the gloves had finished conducting Maud's singing, they simply vanished into thin air. And it is at this point that Maud turned to Jean and said, "You have the devil in this house." Finally, she was convinced. A few days later, Maud's gloves were found in a cupboard. Jean returned them to Maud, who instantly burned them in the back garden. Maud insisted she would not step foot into the house again, not even for £20,000. As time went on in the house, apparently Fred would become very good at materialising objects in thin air. One day Fred floated an egg into the front room and dropped it on the floor, and then another followed. Jean didn't want any more eggs dropping on the floor, so she ran to the fridge and she took out the egg box, and she noticed that there were 2 eggs missing, but the fridge was shut. Jean found a wooden box and placed the eggs inside and sat on the box for good measure. An egg simply materialised and dropped to the ground right in front of her. And so Jean jumped up off the box, looked inside and confirmed that another egg had indeed vanished. So she sat back down on the box straight away, trapping all the eggs inside. There was no possible way that the eggs could get out of this box, but she witnessed every single one smash on the ground right in front of her. When she once again got up off the box and had a look inside, every single egg had disappeared. It would seem that Fred had found a way of moving objects through other physical objects, or he could simply teleport them from one dimension to the other. So now, with the manifestation of objects, it was all getting a little bit too much for the Pritchards once again. Fred loved to make a mess, as we've already established. He loved to mess up the bedrooms, he was tipping milk all over the floor, now he was smashing eggs. He also liked to spread butter and jam on door handles, and he loved to keep the family awake all night by making bumps and bangs. And let's be honest, a night full of bumps and bangs wasn't actually that bad compared to some of the other nights that the Pritchards had gone through. For example, the night when Fred was throwing the paintbrushes around the landing and the paint supplies. There was the night when it trapped Diane on the stairs underneath the furniture, and then went on to toss her out of bed 4 more times that night. Obviously, all these things were starting to wear the family down, so the Pritchards decided to try a different vicar, one who would be willing to perform an exorcism. And so this time round it would be Vic Kelly from across the street who contacted his Catholic priest, Father Hudson. Now, Father Hudson explained that exorcising a poltergeist wasn't always a good idea, as it often makes things even worse. Also, informed Vic that he wouldn't be able to perform the exorcism himself without permission from the church. But there was no reason why Vic couldn't attempt the exorcism. And so Father Hudson gave Vic some holy water and gave him the proper instructions. Later that day, Vic arrived at 30 Years Drive with his holy water in hand. And for some reason, Jean was a little bit reluctant at first, but she eventually allowed Vic to give it a go. And so Vic went all the way around the house, sprinkling every single room, ending in the lounge. And when Vic had finished, Jean inquired when they would know if it had worked. Seconds later, there was a massive crash coming from the upstairs. It would seem it hadn't worked. That night, the poltergeist would not let the family sleep. There was banging, there was crashing. Diane got pulled out of bed multiple times. Finally, around 5 AM, it all calmed down. But they could sense that Fred was not happy at all. It would seem that he did not appreciate the attempt to get him out of his house. As the sun rose and the day started, Jean allowed Diane to stay home from school that day, due to the lack of sleep she had had the night before. But Fred wasn't going to let her enjoy her day off. As she stood brushing her hair, Fred threw the table drawer into her back, and then, as soon as the drawer hit the floor, a crucifix flew from the mantelpiece and attached itself to Diane's back like glue. She started to panic, and she started to claw at the cross that was on her back. She struggled to get it off, it was just not coming loose. All of a sudden a picture flew off the wall of Jesus and landed on the floor, followed by the cross, which had simply just fallen away from Diane's back. Diane had a nasty red mark on her back for a few days after that, and it was in the shape of the cross. Now, a few days later, on Easter Sunday, Fred had actually painted inverted crosses on the walls in the house in golden paint. Now, there was a tin of gold spray paint, but Jean wasn't sure if that is where it had come from. But if it had been that exact paint that Fred had used, it would have been almost impossible to do it by any human hand. It is said that the gold crosses on the wall were done perfectly, with perfect straight lines, which would have been almost impossible to do with the way that the paint comes spraying out of the can. The only way it could have been done was with stencils. After the failed exorcism, it would seem that Fred was attacking anything to do with Christianity, maybe in response to the exorcism. Maybe this was his way of mocking the exorcism, or maybe it was just his way of telling the Pritchards, I know what you did, don't try it again. But Jean was not going to give up right now. After all, this was her house, it wasn't Fred's house, it was her house, and if anyone was going to leave, it was going to be Fred. Now, Jean attempted to contact the church once again, but once again the church let her down, and Fred just continued being disruptive, and he just carried on playing his little pranks around the house, sometimes mischievous, sometimes terrifying. For instance, on one day he took Mrs. Holden's coat and simply hid it in the coal shed. They couldn't find it for days, and obviously when they did, they presumed it would have been damaged. But apparently it came out of the coal shed without a mark on it. Crazy how that is possible, but apparently it did. It came out of the coal shed with no marks whatsoever on it. On another occasion, a friend named Andy Williams visited, and after a while he noticed that the windscreen wipers on his car had been left on, which was strange considering he had the car keys and the car ignition was off. That night, as Andy left, he noticed the house had a strange glow around it. And funnily enough, one of Jean's neighbours has actually confirmed this. She had actually seen the house glowing from her own living room, and it is said that the glow around the house was almost like the house had its own aura. I suppose you could say almost like the house was alive itself. Another strange element of this story, which I also found in Colin Wilson's book, was that the poltergeist had actually managed to reduce the electricity bills in the house, which, let's face it, isn't that bad of a thing really. Maybe it had something to do with the poltergeist's ability to absorb energy, and maybe it had something to do with the glow around the house. On some days, Diane's contents of her bedroom would be thrown outside by the poltergeist, and neighbours helped Jean pick everything up and take it back into the house. On another occasion, as Jean was cleaning out the flue of the fireplace, she was actually showered in keys that had fallen out of the chimney. Now, these keys were 19 in total. Now, most of the keys she recognised, they'd actually gone missing a while back. But one of the keys that she found, she had no idea where it had come from. It didn't seem to belong in the house. It didn't fit any door, it didn't fit any window. She had no idea what this key unlocked. Maybe it unlocked a mystery, but to this day, they still don't know the mystery of that key. On another day, the poltergeist decided to bring in a live wasp's nest, which Jean found in her house, and she disturbed it, and all the wasps came swarming out and stung her multiple times. And you know, at this point, if it sounds like I'm just splurting out occurrence after occurrence, it's because I am, because that many things actually happened to the Pritchards, that much paranormal activity actually happened. It was like one after the other, and it's hard to put it into story context other than just saying one day this happened, another day this happened, on one day this happened. It was that constant, one after the other. And it was random, there was no pattern. Sometimes there'd be a long pause in between the strange things that went on in the house, and then other times they'd have like a little outburst of activity. And you know, it was always bumps, it was always bangs, it was always manifesting objects, throwing things, pushing, using an invisible force. But as we progress to this next stage in the story, you will see that the poltergeist actually starts to manifest and show itself. Now, the first time that the poltergeist decided to manifest in front of the Prichards was late one night as the house lay in a dark silence. As Jean and Joe lay in bed, the bedroom door slowly creaked open, very slowly. They both looked up at the doorway to see the faint apparition of a tall dark figure that wore a hood over its head. Jean flicked the lamp on and the apparition vanished. And it is also said that sometimes at night they could also hear laboured breathing coming from round the corner, as if it was coming from the hallway, and they were too scared to actually get up and go and investigate. They'd actually just leave it be and just wait for it to stop. Now, the next person to see the poltergeist was actually Mrs. Mountain, the next door neighbour, and she actually saw the poltergeist in her own kitchen, in her own house. Now, Mrs. Mountain stood at her sink when she felt a presence enter the room who she believed to be her nephew, who was trying to scare her. She turned around to catch him, and she was confronted by a tall dark figure dressed in a black monk's habit. Now, later Mrs. Mountain would say that the monk looked very real, very solid, like a real monk was stood in the kitchen. Now, Mrs. Mountain said as she stood there in front of this very tall, dark, monk-like figure, that she had a very hard time seeing the monk's face. The monk's face always seemed to be hidden in the shadows of the hood. So, as hard as she tried, all she could see was a dark void. There was no face whatsoever, and this often reminds me of the Grim Reaper. How sometimes you see a skull, but most of the times you just see a dark void with no face at all. Very creepy. It was becoming clear that the activity was becoming more intense. The bangs and the bumps were now louder than ever before, and the monk had also started to introduce farm animal noises at night when the lights went out. So can you imagine now, as well as this thing manifesting in your bedroom doorway at night in the darkness in the form of a monk, as well as the laboured breathing coming from around the doorways, now it was incorporating the sounds of animals, and it is said that it was using the sound of pigs. And I'm sure you're aware that pigs do not make the nicest of sounds, especially when they squeal. So I can only imagine what it would have been like in this house at night time, listening to all these different noises, listening to farm animals squeal and grunt and whatever, and then seeing these visions as well of this monk. I can only imagine. And it is also said that Mrs. Holden also saw the monk, but only the bottom half of his robes. So what all this says to me, if this story is to be believed, is that the poltergeist, or Fred, or whatever you want to call him, he is beginning to become stronger, and he's beginning to find the energy or the power or whatever you want to call it from somewhere to start and manifest. And now you might say that we're coming up to the climax of the Prichard story, where things got intensely worse, you might say violently worse. So one of the most terrifying encounters happened one day as the lights once again went out, indicating that the monk, or Fred, was going to make himself heard or seen. As Jean looked for the torch, she heard Diane scream. Now, it wasn't completely dark outside, and a little bit of light was still coming through the windows, so as Jean went into the hallway to see what Diane was screaming about, she noticed right away that Diane was actually being dragged up the stairs by a cardigan by some force. She was also being choked by an invisible hand. Jean shouted for Philip, and they both ran to Diane and grabbed her on the stairs and tried in vain to pull her down, but the entity was too strong. They just simply clung onto her as she was being pulled up the stairs by the cardigan and being choked at the same time. Now, later on, Philip claimed that it was as if the poltergeist was listening. Philip claimed that in his head he was telling the poltergeist to let go, and it simply did. And when it did this, Jean, Philip and Diane all fell back down the stairs. They quickly ran away from the bottom of the stairs and got the lights back on, and when they did, they noticed that Diane's neck was completely covered in red finger marks. Now, this was as bad as a haunting ever got. It was as violent as it ever got. The story of the Black Monk of Pontefract haunting the Prichards was now coming to an end. There was a few other strange things that happened, like the floor being drenched in water with huge footprints embedded in the wet carpet, but nothing else really happened of consequence until one day when Philip and Diane sat in the lounge watching TV. Their gaze fell upon the frosted glass doors that separated the lounge from the kitchen. On the other side of the glass, they saw a tall, dark figure walk past. As Philip bravely opened the frosted glass doors, they saw the black shape of the monk disappearing into the kitchen floor. This would be the last time that the Prichards would ever see the monk again. Now, it is said that they had hung garlic around the house because they had heard somewhere that it was a deterrent. I've only ever heard that garlic gets rid of vampires, but they always wondered whether this had something to do with it, or whether the monk had simply decided enough was enough and it was time to move on. Or maybe the poltergeist only visits for a couple of years and then lies dormant again for a few more years, as it did the first time round, how it appeared and then it went away for a few years and then it came back. Who knows, but what I can say is at the time it didn't return, and the Prichards actually made the house a home. They redecorated, they refurnished, and they finally got on with their lives. Around 10 years later, a man named Tom Cunliffe had decided to investigate the area of 30 Years Drive. He was interested in local history and knew of a priory that existed from 1090 until 1539 in the area. He decided to get in touch with Jean, who told him the full story of the haunting. There was one piece of information that Tom was really interested in. Apparently, one of Jean's neighbours had once found a book in the local library which told of a Cluniac monk who had been found guilty of rape and murder by strangulation of a young girl around the time of Henry VIII, not long before the priory would have been destroyed, and apparently the monk hanged for his crimes. Now, after a bit more research, it was found that the land where the Prichard house stood was once home to a small bridge that was called Priest Bridge, and on the hill where the house was built once stood the gallows, the place of hangings. Tom's theory was that the monk was hanged for his crimes where the house now stands, so the spirit of the monk went on to haunt the house. And due to the way the monk seemed to single out Diane in its more vicious attacks, including strangulation on the stairs, the poltergeist's intent could have been sexual. But all this is only theory. Although the gallows and the bridge probably did exist, there's no proof of a monk being hung for murder. The book Jean's friend mentioned was never found. Although Colin Wilson's book Poltergeist, which I read in preparation for this episode, does mention that he found evidence of a vicar that was hanged, but not for rape or murder. One theory Colin had was that this poltergeist was listening and playing a game and responding to what people were saying in the house. For instance, Mr. O'Donnell mentioned how poltergeists like to destroy photographs, and of course, what was the next thing to happen? Jean's wedding picture was destroyed by the poltergeist. Apparently, just before the grandfather clock was smashed to pieces when it was pushed down the stairs, someone had commented on how they were surprised that it was still working and how they admired it so much. And then, of course, the next thing, it was pushed down the stairs. And then, of course, we had the incident with the crosses on the walls that were painted upside down. And then there was the cross that stuck to Diane's back. And then the pictures of Jesus falling to the floor. All this happened after Vic had tried to bless the house with holy water, so maybe this was a response from Fred, saying, "You're not going to get me out with faith. This is what I think of faith." And then there is a possibility that maybe someone mentioned that they thought they saw the apparition of a monk, and so Fred, the poltergeist, takes on the appearance of a monk. Or maybe it was actually more than one entity in the house. One thing that Colin Wilson did mention before he finished his story was that Diane had mentioned something to him once that she had not included in the main story, because at the time she believed she was simply dreaming. Diane told Colin that when she was 6 years old, she came out of her bedroom one day to see an old lady dressed in grey standing outside of her mother's bedroom door, the same bedroom door where the monk would be seen many years later. Now, at this time, Jean presumed that Diane was dreaming and thought no more of it. You see, the thing is, at this point in time, the hauntings hadn't started yet. They weren't aware that they were living in a haunted house. So the grey lady stood at Jean's door could have well have been a dream, but there is that slight possibility that it could have also been a ghost. As time went by, Diane and Philip eventually grew older and moved out of the house. On the 21st of June 1986, Joe had a heart attack and died on the bathroom floor in the house. And Jean continued to live in the house for the next 25 years or so with her pet parrot. And it is said that Jean never felt truly alone in that house. And so the Prichard horror story finally comes to an end. But fast forward to the present day, and it would seem that the Black Monk has indeed made a return. And so now our story has come back to where we started at the beginning of episode 1. Like I said, there was a movie made inspired by the Poltergeist case. Mr. Pat Holden was the director of the movie when the lights went out. Pat had grew up with the stories that had happened at 30 East Drive. You see, Pat's mother actually knew Jean, and she was a believer in the Poltergeist case. So Pat had been around it for most of his life, and as he grew up, he eventually became interested in film and making movies, and he had decided that he wanted to make a movie on this Poltergeist case on 30 East Drive, and that is exactly what he did. And so when they got around to actually making the movie, they didn't film in the actual house at 30 East Drive. You see, they didn't want to bother Jean, who at this time would have been an old lady now. And so they recreated the house interior in a film studio. And once the movie had wrapped, the producer Bill Bungay started to look for imaginative ways to promote the movie. And Bill actually discovered that 30 East Drive was actually empty and had been for sale for almost 4 years. Jean was probably getting to the point in life where she couldn't look after herself, and she had gone to live in a retirement home. Now, it would seem that no one was willing to purchase 30 East Drive, probably due to its legacy, its history. Not many people want to live in a haunted house. And so, because of this, the house was cheap. It was very cheap. And Bill had a crazy idea to purchase a house and have the movie's premiere inside. And 2 lucky competition winners would be invited to the screening, which would be held in the front room of 30 East Drive. And that is exactly what happened. Now, I think I mentioned at the beginning of episode 1, I've actually seen this movie. I bought it on Blu-ray in preparation for this episode. And once the film had finished, which was very good, may I add, it was a really good film. Once the film had finished, I went over to the Blu-ray special features like I always do. And they actually had footage of this premiere night, showing the 2 competition winners being interviewed at the front door and then going into the house and watching the actual film in the living room. And so the 2 lucky competition winners were 2 men named Paul and Chris, and they won and they got to watch the movie, like I said, in the front room where the Black Monk terrorised the Prichards all those years ago. The men were interviewed as they walked down the red carpet, and then they were interviewed after the movie. They loved the movie, but unfortunately they didn't witness anything paranormal that night. They were given a box of holy water, a Bible and garlic and crucifixes as they entered, and it was all treated as a little bit of fun. And just like that, the main promotion for the movie was over, and Bill was left with a house on his hands. And if he was being 100% honest with himself, he didn't really believe that the house was haunted. That is until Bill met Carol, the next door neighbour, who warned him that the monk was still here and wasn't happy. Apparently, Carol was sensitive to spirits and could communicate with the monk on some level. She explained the monk was still active and he could be heard at night making banging noises, and from time to time he would venture into her house, which was Mrs. Mountain's house at the time all those years back. And if you remember, Mrs. Mountain actually saw the monk in her own kitchen, so it would make sense that if this poltergeist is still active, it would still travel from house to house. Now, even though Carol had told him all this, Bill politely made it known that he didn't believe in any of this nonsense. That is until he started to experience paranormal activity himself in 30 East Drive. And here are a few examples that I have found whilst researching this case. During the promotion of the movie, he handed his phone over to a lady named Lisa to take a photo of himself and the cast members. And at this point, his phone was 75% charged. And as soon as she tried to take the picture, the phone just died. The battery drained straight away. The picture, it would seem, hadn't been taken. But a few weeks later, it popped up on his phone, out of nowhere, and he couldn't explain this. And I must admit, whenever you watch these paranormal investigations take place on these TV shows that are a dime a dozen at the moment, how many times have you seen some of their electrical equipment, mainly like the cameras, drain straight away, even though they had a full battery? So I found this piece of information interesting. On another occasion, Bill allowed a mini documentary to take place, funded by Bing, the search engine, and the crew had some stories to tell once filming was over. Apparently, not a lot happened during the filming, but when the cameras stopped, the activity started. Apparently, the kettle started switching on and off all by itself over and over again. This sounds very, very familiar to what actually happened to the Prichards on the first day of the haunting. In between filming for the documentary, the crew actually spent the night at the house. They found it easier rather than travelling to and fro, so they actually just spent the night there. One of the crew members awoke in the middle of the night after feeling like they were being held down against their will. And this also mirrors what happened to Diane when the Prichards were being haunted. She was constantly being held down by things. Okay, it wasn't directly from the entity, but there were times when she was being held down by a big piece of furniture or a mattress. On another occasion, one of the crew members had lost a big bundle of keys, and we already know that the poltergeist had a bit of an obsession over keys. After all, Jean found quite a lot of keys up the chimney when the activity was at its peak. But there's nothing strange about losing your keys, right? Well, actually, they were found in a very strange place. You see, the keys were found inside a 1970s era vacuum cleaner that Bill had bought as a prop for the house to make it feel like you had stepped into the 1970s. Now, if I'm picturing what this vacuum cleaner would have looked like, I believe my mother would have had one when I was little. I believe it would have been an upright vacuum cleaner and the bag would have held down the side of the handle. It would have been like in between the handle and the base of the hoover, and that is where all the dirt would have been sucked into. And that is where they actually found the keys. And like I said, this vacuum cleaner was purely a prop. Apparently, it didn't actually work. You could not make it pick things up. It didn't turn on. So how could it have possibly sucked up these keys that they found inside the bag? Over time, Bill allowed people into the house to investigate, including friends and actual paranormal investigators. And with the more people who went into the house, the more reports that he got of paranormal activity. And slowly, Bill was starting to believe as descriptions of the activity poured in. There were constant bumps and bangs. Shadows of a man were seen that walked through walls. Objects flew through the air, like marbles and pennies that seemed to manifest from nowhere. Another ability that the monk liked to exploit. Also, people reported that they felt they were being touched in the house by an unseen hand. Some people suffered night terrors in the house when sleeping over, and the TV had been known to power on from time to time, despite being unplugged. Bill invited hardened skeptics to the house in an attempt to convince himself, more than others, that all this was just examples of an overactive imagination. But when the skeptics left the house, they often left doubting their own mind, and they were very badly shaken up. Now, at the time of recording this episode, Bill actually still owns a house at 30 East Drive, and for a price you can actually pay to spend the night there. You can make a booking at www.30eastdrive.com, and I must say, this website is worth a visit. Even if you're not making a booking, you can read actual testimonies of people who have stayed there, who have submitted their stories to the website, and it is quite interesting. But if you were to make a booking, you would be greeted by Carol, the next door neighbour who lives where Mrs. Mountain lived at the time. She will greet the guests and she gives them the tour with a few creepy stories before leaving them alone for the night in the house. Carol also looks after the cleaning and the upkeep of the house, and she has many, many stories to tell. The house is constantly visited by amateur paranormal investigators and professional investigators. YouTubers and TV shows have all either reported not seeing much at all or seeing an extremely high amount of paranormal activity, and I simply can't cover everything. This episode would literally go on forever and most likely become very repetitive. If you want to read more on the Black Monk of Pontefract, I can recommend 2 books that I used as sources. Like I said before, Colin Wilson's Poltergeist, A Study in Destructive Haunting, is probably one of the best books you can read on this case. And then we have Richard Estep and Bill Bungay's The Black Monk of Pontefract, the world's most violent and relentless poltergeist. Both books are packed with information, and I mean that they are absolutely packed. They are both really good reads. In fact, if you've got Amazon Prime, I believe you can read the second book absolutely free on your Kindle. That's how I actually read the second book, and I must admit there are elements to this book which are really interesting. They actually mention that the previous owners who lived in the house before the Prichards actually reported some strange things happening in the house, more like feelings in the house, like dark, depressive feelings, and it actually prompted them to do a house swap with the Prichards, and that is how it actually all come about, that the Prichards lived in this house. It was actually due to a house swap, and then the haunting wouldn't take place for quite some time later. But apparently, according to this book, there was a family who lived in the house beforehand who felt that there was something negative in this house and they couldn't call it a home, and so they arranged the house swap. But it is interesting to mention that there are many other houses in the same area in Pontefract that many people claim are haunted. And it has actually led many to believe that it's not actually the houses that are haunted. It could actually be the land that is haunted. So what do you think? Is the Black Monk of Pontefract just some sensational hoax that has been reignited to make money in the modern day? Or is it possible that the evil spirit of a murderous monk drifts from room to room at 30 East Drive when the lights go out? As always, I'll let you decide. Take care, and I'll see you soon. And please, don't have nightmares.